In the last video, I talked a little bit about this idea of classical economic theory, the theory that sort of underpins all of the other economic theories, since they all basically view themselves as either an improvement or an erosion from the original classical economic concept. And we ended up by talking about two ideas. This idea that in order to have a truly capitalist classical economic theory state, you had to have perfect competition and a non-interventionist government, a government capable or willing of staying out of the way. Well, that's fine. The problem is that both of these assumptions are very frequently violated. In fact, what we've learned over the last 100 years or so, especially have come to believe over the last 80 years or so, is that there are some basic fundamental flaws in classical economic theory. So what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about what these flaws are, and then also get in a little bit to maybe some examples of these flaws. So what are they? Well, the first one is that when Adam Smith was thinking about this idea of production and investment and consumption, he was by and large assuming that most things would fall under the category of private property, that most ideas and most land, most products being produced would be private in nature. So I could have a contract where I sell my private property, even if that's my labor, to you in exchange for either a commoditized currency or goods and services. The problem is that there are actually quite a few goods in our society that aren't private, or to the degree that they're not private, the property rights are questionable or transient. Think about water supplies. When water falls onto a particular square mile of ground, who owns the water? Well, in theory, it could belong to the people whose land the water landed on. But at the same time, that water will flow into a river or a stream, into a watershed, or will ultimately become part of some aquifer, or part of a ground table, or a lake that's a reservoir that's going to be feeding a major city. So if I have a crop that depends upon water through irrigation, it's very important that the water that falls on your land ends up being available for my consumption, even if I might be living hundreds or even 1,000 miles away from the original source. In addition to this question of property and the need to think about public goods, there's also something that we've learned about called market failure. A market failure is essentially a condition where either producers manufacture things that cannot sell, or where consumers want to purchase something that they cannot buy. There are lots of examples of market failure, and in fact I would encourage you to go to YouTube and just type in a search for market failure and look at some of these, like monopoly or monopsony, or some examples like environmental degradation or negative externalities. There's a wide range of these. The point is that when I have market failure, even if it seems like the laws of supply and demand should be able to regulate production and consumption, there are lots of situations where they don't, or they don't do it well enough, and costs become out of line with what people are really willing to pay. A third problem is that, as we mentioned in the first video, classical economic theory is kind of immoral or unethical in how it picks winners and losers. Now, we like to think that, well, the person who wins under a classical economic theory circumstance will be the one who works the hardest and designs the best product, and that's sort of true. But the reality is, sometimes victory is just simply a function of dumb luck. If you're a farmer, it rains or it doesn't. And you could be an excellent farmer, but if you're growing a high water crop, a couple of years of drought will pretty much destroy your business. The other problem is that although we like to say that cheaters never prosper, there are actually some conditions under capitalism or classical economic theory where, over the short term at least, cheating firms or cheating consumers can actually rig the system to their advantage. Now, that may catch up with them eventually, but in the near term, the damage can be somewhere between considerable and catastrophic. A fourth problem that we don't often think about is that capitalism and democracy, while they go well together, don't work together perfectly. A couple of different reasons for that. On the one hand, democracy assumes a certain level of equality or egalitarianism, whereas capitalism almost requires that some people are going to benefit more than others. What this means is that if you're in a democratic political system, where things like the ability to advertise or to get out the vote are going to change political outcomes, those people who've benefited the most from capitalism can subvert the democratic process, can basically buy extra access to government, if you will. A second problem with capitalism and democracy is that we assume under capitalism or CET that I'm not going to allow government to get involved in the political system. But if it's a democracy, the pressure to continue to receive votes in the next election can be so great that government intervention is almost assured. So really, capitalism and democracy, while they go well together, don't work perfectly well together. And then the final thing that we need to think about is that perfect capitalism can often result in regime instability or government instability. And here's the reason why. What you see on your screen is something called a business cycle. And we assume under classical economic theory that business cycles are inevitable. In virtually every business cycle situation, I'll have this rising period of growth where people have more and more money, producers are making more and more stuff, consumers are using the money they make to buy that extra stuff. But in virtually every economic system, virtually in every economy, there's going to reach a period where we have overproduced, where there are too many houses in the market or too many cars in the market, and people just simply can't buy or rent or purchase all of the excess inventory. Now, when that happens, manufacturers will have no choice but to cut the supply of their labor pool. When they fire workers, workers buy less stuff. When they buy less stuff, the problem of excess inventory begins to spiral. Now, at some point, CET argues that I'll reach a low point in the cycle where I've fired enough of my employees and I will have sold off enough of my excess inventory at discounted rates that eventually a recovery will take place and I'll have to start making stuff again. But during that interim period, that recession or that depression, if you're an elected official, your chances of getting reelected drop considerably. What does that mean? Well, it means that all regimes, even democratic regimes, all regimes are going to have a vested interest in trying to get involved in the economy whenever I hit one of these low points, which ultimately means that capitalism doesn't work and can lead to an unstable regime environment. So what are some of the solutions? What are some of the ways that I can try to fix classical economic theory to make it work? Well, I don't want to get into too much detail, but I will tell you about 4 things that the book is going to mention whenever it's discussing government interventions into the economy. The first of these is something called monetary policy. Monetary policy is simply the regulations of the size of money or the amount of currency that's available in the system. The general assumption is the more money, the cheaper goods are. But also, the more money, not only will goods become cheaper, but I'll have to pay people more, so I'll have inflation. So I can control things like the prices of goods and the level of production and rates of inflation by manipulating the money supply. A second thing that I can do is I can engage in fiscal policy, be it Keynesian supply-side economic, or Keynesian theory, which is a consumer-based theory, or supply-side economic theory. With either Keynesianism or supply-side theory, the goal is to try to manipulate the economy in some way to make one sector grow to boost the other sector, either stimulate demand or stimulate production so we hire more workers. I can also control economic growth by using a tax policy. That may mean taxing the rich more to achieve egalitarian standards, or it might mean taxing the poor more, so I encourage people to get richer and richer and be less poor. And the final thing that I can do is I can engage in a regulatory policy scheme, where I try to deal with some of the problems of classical economic theory by making you, as a producer or consumer, follow certain regulations. Think about quality control standards, or environmental protections, or labor laws. All these examples of regulatory policy designed to try to solve failures of assumptions in classical economic theory.